in proportion to the blue is growing substantially, which means there's a larger proportion of these calls that are not being reported. And just why this matters, if you look at the blue, that's the conversation we're having about data right now. Well, we say, vehicle burglaries have decreased since 2020 because the amount reported have decreased. But if we take into consideration all calls for vehicle burglaries, it's actually higher right now than it is in 2020. We're just not collecting that data because response times have increased. So this changes the conversation. Now, just the same concept, but for violent crimes overall. Again, the full area is all calls for violent crime to 911. The blue, reports to follow, are calls that are being made, the police show up, and people are still there, so the crime can be reported. And then the red is when the police show up, gone on arrival, the person is no longer there, and the report cannot be filed. Again, in 2022, you can see that the red in proportion to the blue is growing, so there's a higher proportion of violent crimes that are not being reported right now. And also, just the magnitude is being washed out by losing these calls overall for violent crime.
So just to sort of bring it all together, we know that crime underreporting happens. We know from the National Crime Victimization Survey that something like 43% of violent crimes, 23% of rape, sexual assaults are and a third of property crimes are reported to law enforcement each year. So we know that these things are happening and they're already naturally underreported. This adds an additional layer of underreporting. As Rachel mentioned, it affects our conversation that we're having around these issues. It also affects police-community relations. People know it's going to take a long time. If they know it's going to take a long time, one, they may be less likely to report this incident, and they may be less likely to report the next time it happens, or they'll tell their friends about it, and their friends are less likely to report it. I mean, I think that we've all had these anecdotes of these things happening. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that the commission strength is unlikely to begin increasing anytime soon. I mean, we know that there's issues of recruitment. We know that there's issues of separations. I wouldn't place a bet on when we're going to start to see it increasing. Obviously, we're all rooting for it to stop this slide, but we don't know what it's going to look like. But I think that the evidence suggests that this trend is not going to change at any time. And we talked about this the last time we presented a report, that reducing the burden of commissioned officers on these calls for service is one of the most powerful, arguably the only real strong tool that we have to improve response times and also improve the ability of officers to have more time to respond to violent crimes and to solve murders, to solve repeat carjackings and things like that. And so, increasing civilianization, these are not new topics, I know, to this council, increasing civilianization, expanding the use of online and phone reporting, acknowledging that the second bullet point is going to be with us for a while, and helping that to hopefully inform whatever the solutions is how we at least see as the most likely path out. So, pending your questions, that concludes our slides.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. Councilmember J.P. Morrell.
Thank you. I want to begin by saying I think it's important to note that when you factor in gone on arrivals and you look at those graphs, when we've had previous slides from the NOPD reflecting where crime is currently, there is no accounting for gone on arrivals whatsoever, correct?
Very minimally. I mean, if something's marked gone on arrival, they have, I think, up to 72 hours to change the disposition. You can still report it after the fact, so there's probably a few that get that way, but I would expect that for the most part, very few of those are accounted for in the crime numbers.
So for example, when we look at some of the numbers we were given previously on slides that talk about things like, let's say that aggravated rape is down. If you factor in that tremendous gone on arrival metric, and let's be very clear, when we talk about, and this is something I think we'll have to let you have you get into at a different time, Jeff, but there is actually also a further micro-analysis as far as response times by council district, because certain council districts, D and E, for example, have much longer response times than other council districts. So when you're talking about that median language, that's for the whole city.
Yes.
That's not for a council district by council district analysis, which we will also need at some point. Because I think that when I hear people from District B who are complaining about a response time of 30 minutes in comparison to someone from District D who has a 3-hour response time, I think the expectation between both is that it should be lower than what they're receiving. So you don't have that data as of yet, I'm assuming, and we'll have to work on getting you that data.
Yeah, we can certainly break it down by individual districts and are happy to do that and to report on that. And you're absolutely right that it does affect it because District D it has the most officers assigned there, but geographically it's by far the largest district, and there's no way that you can account for the geographic size of the district with having a 5 or 10% more officers assigned there on patrol. It's just too monumental. Same with District D. Throughout District A as well, as geographically is a large district, and the more compact districts are going to have, just because there's less way to go.
And there's no correlation even between districts, council mag district and police districts. So for example, half of District A and a large portion of District D are all serviced by one police district, which is District 3, for example. So I mean, even when you're looking at that analysis as a whole, having that council mag district numbers can be very important. And I'm sure you're aware, I filed legislation that's coming up on the 4th regarding data access for groups like yourselves so that we can have raw data access, because I think last time we had you before us, there was some conflict because since you don't have access to raw data, you're using publicly available information to make estimates, and there was a discrepancy pursuant to the chief between the information you had versus the information he had, and there'll be an effort to rectify that, showing we all have the exact same information so we can have best practices. I guess a question I have is that for my own analysis, the median response time in 2016 was about 48 minutes in the city of New Orleans. In 2017, I know this number ebbed and flows. In 2017, that went up to 68 minutes, which was about a 40% increase. If we look at response times from 2016 to 2021, which is that 150 number you're using, you're talking about almost a 300% increase in response time. I think that for those people who anecdotally know from their own personal experience that response times are high, I don't even think they comprehend how much higher response times are today versus a year, 2 years, or 3 years ago. And I think for a lot of people, what they've seen personally is if someone last time they reported a crime, for example, for a car break-in, was 2018, and the expectation of response time was based upon that 2018 experience, then it is a punch in the face if you thought you were looking at a 40-minute response time and now it's a 150-minute response time. So I think that when we talk to constituents who are frustrated with response times, it's because you only interact with the NOPD when you have an incident, and it's jarring how that can change in a very short period of time. I want to ask for a general assessment, and I think that it's something that the council should consider. For the most part, has there ever been a deep dive on these gone on arrivals or unfoundeds to find out how much effort is being made by NOPD on follow-up for gone on arrivals?
Not that I'm aware of, but I know that when this was an issue in the 2015-2016 timeframe, there was certainly an effort to reduce them. And if you recall, back then they were all unfounded, and now they've just sort of switched from unfounded to gone on arrivals. But I don't know the degree to which there's been any analysis or research in what happened and what could have, other than a quicker response time, could have improved the likelihood of the incident being successfully reported.
Would you be surprised if I told you in, in all of our surrounding parishes, there is zero call backlog?
Not particularly.
And based upon reporting we saw from the incident that happened last Friday, we're averaging a call backlog as high as 40 calls on any given moment in the city of New Orleans.
Yeah, and I think that there's probably lots of times when it's higher than that. And I think that if you know, the Times-Picayune story that was out last week talked about it as these younger officers, they're working patrol, they come on and it's all backlog, and it's just sort of trying to constantly swim to catch up. Yeah,
Or basically trying to like use sandbags to stop the flow of a flood when you appear on the scene that's already flooding.
yeah.
I try to find analogies to help people kind of understand the state of where we're at. And I was talking to my wife last night, who's a nurse, and we're having a conversation because she really wasn't comprehending kind of the state of the problem with where we are based upon that story from last week. So most nurses, their patient to nurse ratio is supposed to be between 2 patients to 4 patients per nurse. That is what is recommended nationally so that nurses can effectively do their job. I think a good analogy would be, and the idea being that once you get beyond four patients to a nurse, you have a significant public health concern because nurses can't appropriately treat their patients. I think when you look at call time as you've presented it and how call time is directly negatively impacted by the dwindling police force, I think a good analogy would be like having a nurse in a hospital that has 20 patients.
Well, and we see that within NOPD itself, that I think the recommended number of homicides per detective that each detective works, the homicide detectives works, is somewhere in the 4 to 6 range. And last year we had detectives working 14 homicides in a year. And so there's just not the commission strength to be able to have enough people working homicides. And homicide clearances is a critical thing for a police department. It's critical for obviously getting murders off the streets, for building police community relations, for preventing retribution killings. But